Phenomenal guest here. I've taken some of his online course at Hillsdale College. That is charlieforhillsdale.com. It's Dr. Kevin Slack. His book is War on the American Republic, How Liberalism Became Despotism. Dr. Slack, welcome to the program. I want to talk to you mostly about this idea of immigration and the Founding Fathers. I want to ask you, what were the American founders' view on immigration? How did they incorporate that into law? Because if you were to ask just a regular person, they'd say one thing: we are a nation of immigrants, everyone should be welcome, and that's what the founders believe. Was that the founders' view on immigration? Please educate our audience. Take as much time as you please.
No, and some of the founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin was probably the first to write about immigration. He does this in 1751 in his observations. His real concern was that he had tried to form, this was an extra-legal militia. It was a military association because the Pennsylvania Quakers in the Assembly wouldn't raise money for defense. And so he appeals to all of these different ethnicities in Pennsylvania to unite for the defense of life, liberty, and property. It was a veritable social contract. It was extra-legal, and the idea was that they would protect themselves, all these different groups, the middling artisans of Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, against threats from the French and pirates on the Delaware as well as on the frontier. And what he saw is that many of the Germans who had come over, they'd migrated en masse to the colonies, had not participated in this effort, even though he tried to woo them into it. And so in 1751, he'd made this effort in 1747. In 1751, he starts railing against the German immigrants. And he says, why are we bringing in all of these German migrants? He says, rather, what's going to happen, they don't learn our language, they don't have our habits, they don't appreciate our laws. And that instead of Anglifying them, they're going to Germanize us. And so he stresses this idea of assimilation. Now, he would change his views on the Germans and the Scotch-Irish over time, but one thing that he stressed, and this was adopted by the other founders, somebody like Thomas Jefferson as well, was the idea of unity. How is it that affection binds a people together to command the kind of sacrifices that are necessary to preserve a people? So when we talk about a people, we say Americans, it means we're presupposing that that entity exists and that it has something in common. And that meant that the foremost, if you read Franklin or Thomas Jefferson, what they really look to is to try to get your own citizens to have more kids. So that was immigration awareness number one, was we actually don't want to bring in lots and lots of immigrants because of certain threats that they pose, although we do admit immigrants. But it wasn't a nation of immigrants. That's a much later teaching that I think you can trace to the 1920s. The idea of a nation of immigrants really takes off in the 1950s. Thomas Jefferson and Franklin, they both really questioned whether we should bring over many of the old world European immigrants. And so I think that's a second point. First, you have the idea of a common mind. What binds us together as a people? And the second was the kind of character. What are the manners and the habits of the people that are coming over? And what kind of institutions will they endorse if they're allowed to vote in our political system? Is it the case that they're going to bring over some of the bad policies and habits that they had left and that they had fled from? So that was a second major important point. It's also the case that if we're going to be honest, the founders' warning to us would be that diversity undermines unity. And that's why, if you get to the first Naturalization Act of 1790, and this is just truth, it may offend us today, but the founders said only free whites could become citizens. And the reason for that wasn't just you have ideas of inequality, natural inequality, but even Franklin in the 1760s, he visits the Negro school, and he says, well, I've changed my mind about these black children. It seems like they can learn just like white children. But even then, he says, I hope that will discourage migration. And the reason that Franklin and Jefferson as well, took this position and notes on the state of Virginia, was they didn't think you could have Republican freedoms if you had a population that was torn apart by faction. And so this becomes, of course, this guides immigration policy, who can become a citizen, all the way until the 14th Amendment and the new Naturalization Act of 1870. And that's when white Americans say, particularly the radical Republicans, they could see that the attempt on the part of the Southerners was to reintroduce slavery through a loophole in the 13th Amendment. And so in the 14th Amendment, they recognized natural-born citizenship for the freedmen, as well as they changed naturalization policy. And so you have whites and blacks can become citizens. This did not include other races. This did not include Asians, for purposes of migration. In order to include Indians, that status would change for Indians under public law in the 1920s. What and why? Why did they do this? Well, I think it was those three basic points. One was how do you have a common mind? The idea of a common citizenry, so you have a country for its citizens. Second, how do we bring over immigrants who are going to share some of our common values? This is one of the reasons why the laborers did not want a large number of Chinese immigrants at the end of the 19th century. They were very much afraid that they would bring over a kind of paternalistic view of the ends of government. It's also why many of the Irish pose such a problem. 75% of the Germans, they migrated off to the countryside, but about 75% of the Irish settled down in major cities. And the claim is they brought much of their paternalistic or view of government that focused on patronage. And of course, every time you have mass migration, it increases crime. It also increases the entitlements program or the welfare programs of the localities and the states, and of course today the federal government. And so from 1880 to 1920, we do see a change. We see the admittance of new groups. And I think that for us, and we can look at the last two waves of immigration, this poses a kind of challenge. And that is, in the founding period, they thought diversity undermined the kind of order necessary for Republican freedoms. We have a diverse regime, all right? That's what we know. And I think the challenge to us is how do we maintain this sense of unity so we can protect those Republican freedoms and freedom under the law? And so I can go to the last two waves in law. You have 1880 to 1920. These were largely Southeastern Europeans. And that created all kinds of problems, the attempt to assimilate them into the body politic. It was also the case that they introduced new institutions to try to manage the migrants. What we look at as the family courts today. If you read Roscoe Pound, this was the dean of Harvard Law, he's writing about the family courts. And he says these are introduced to manage all of these Southeastern Europeans who are coming over here who don't know our ways. And so in the family court, you don't have due process rights. You have maxims of equity that guide all the rulings of the judge. If you don't follow them, you're in contempt of court. So what happened after the 1920s was two laws passed, 1921 and 1924, and they introduced a national origins quota, and this would have basically froze out those who could migrate to the United States. 70% of all migrants would come from just 3 countries, Northwestern European countries. But the real effect of that immigration law of 1924 was it stopped immigration generally. So the percentage of foreign born in 1920 was about 14%. When you get to 1960, it's about 4 or 5%. And what that meant was all Americans just had more kids, Americans of all different races, because there was a prioritization on those who were natural-born citizens. The 1965 Immigration Act, as we all know, changed much of that. And one of the great dangers that it introduced was this. At every period of mass migration, whether you talk about the Irish in the 1840s or the migrations from Southeastern Europe, 1880 to 1920, that you had a period of assimilation that followed these waves. What's happened since 1965 is an ever-increasing number of migrants, and it poses that great threat to us that I think the founders warned about, and that is how do we maintain some kind of a unified... Yeah, go ahead.
So, no, please, that was phenomenal. I want to make sure it's very clear. Was diversity a stated value of the American founders? Because we're told that diversity is our strength. Was that a founding value of America? 2 minutes remaining, Dr. Slack.
No, in the terms that we use it today. What kind of diversity was valuable? Well, if you read Madison in Federalist 10, he talks about diversity of talents and property. Yeah, that's valuable. But if you get to the end of Federalist 10, he warns about a lack of any common sense of the whole. And so there's a mean that has to be achieved. And then obviously, again, the founders did not think we could have a racially diverse body politic that would also secure Republican freedoms. And that's why in the Naturalization Act, again, one of the first acts passed by Congress in 1790, only free whites could become citizens. They were afraid. And this is why, James Madison was president of the American Colonization Society. So anytime, I have an establishment Republican, they look at me and they say, well, Madison loved diversity. And you say, he was president of an organization whose end was to ship blacks back to Africa. That's the kind of diversity the American founders thought possible with regard to race. Now, again, we don't agree with that anymore, but I think it remains a challenge to us. And who was around in 2020 that didn't see this appeal to tribalism flare back up? And I think this is where Trump has been excellent in trying to appeal to the things that unify us as Americans.
Did you know that over 140,000 family farms in the United States have shut down since 2017? It's because a lot of meat in the grocery stores is imported. We need to change that. It's time to spring into action and put American farms first. GoodRanchers.com delivers high-quality, American-raised meat to your door. And right now, you could subscribe to any box of theirs and get free bacon, ground beef, seed oil-free chicken nuggets, or salmon for a year and $40 off. Visit GoodRanchers.com to shop, subscribe, and stand with American ranchers. Good Ranchers, American meat delivered. I need to ask about the 14th Amendment. Do you believe the intent of the 14th Amendment was to apply to the children of illegal aliens? Do you believe that was the original intent, and how should we think about it in a modern context?
No, I think it's kind of absurd that those who ratified the 14th Amendment would have thought that it applied to the children of illegals, even when the Supreme Court weighed in to establish those who were born on U.S. soil were U.S. citizens, that it was for a migrant worker who was here legally. So no, I don't think it applies. Obviously, in the 14th Amendment, you've got that clause that talks about those who are not subject to a foreign jurisdiction, and all those who are illegal immigrants would apply. That they would be classified under that clause. So the Supreme Court's never ruled on that. We can see a case like Plyler v. Doe. They've talked about certain rights of the children of illegal immigrants to education in the United States, but Supreme Court's never actually ruled on that question. Whether birthright citizenship applies to those who are here illegally. Not legally, those who are here to work, but those who are here illegally.
Very good. And so going back to this idea of the founders and their intent on immigration, it seems as if we are just constantly flooded with this idea that we must allow in the entire world and the entire planet. You said something noteworthy to me, which is faction. It seems as if we are suffering under great faction here in this country. In fact, it seems as if we are a nation of strangers, not a nation of neighbors, that we all have different origin stories, sometimes different languages, and we are ships passing in the night. Talk more about the founders' caution around faction and connect it to some of the things that we're experiencing today in 2025.
Well, you know, Madison, he defines faction in Federalist 10. He says, any time that there is an individual or a group whose ends would deprive other citizens of their rights, that's a faction. So he's in favor of interest groups. But the real caution that I think the founders give us with regard to faction of ethnicity, race, those kinds of things, is you begin to see yourself as a member of a certain insular tribe. That's why they're cautious about some of these religious groups. You know, Roman Catholics, Jews, they were less than, you know, maybe 1% of the population. So Federalist 2 talks about all the things that would unite a people. And that would be a common language, common customs, common religion, common ethnicity, migrating from the same parts of Europe. So that was their idea as to what would help root a people, that would help to maintain the affection that would preserve the common and the common good. I think what we've seen, and this is particularly since, I mean, we see two movements of this. The first one begins in the 1920s, and that's where you have certain thinkers who begin to argue that they ought to be able to maintain their group identity as well as be citizens of the United States. And so the argument there is America is nothing but an idea. And that really begins, as best as I can tell, in the 1920s. And so you have Elaine Locke talking about the new Negro and blacks being able to retain their own identity. You have the same thing for Jews in the 1920s, talking about how all these groups, they ought not to have to assimilate, but rather America is just a mere idea. It has no common ethical principles, and of course they extend that to religion and all these other things. The danger with that is, in that kind of mentality, is that once you begin to import more and more groups, they keep their tribal identities, and there's no longer a pressure to assimilate. And by the time you get to the late 60s, then the problem is that in the interpretation of what, you know, the 64 Civil Rights Act, whether you agree with it in relation to the government, federal government to private business or not, that what had been a colorblind act, at least in its intentions, was interpreted in a very lawless way to begin to recognize different groups And you have to understand, this is why the founders revolted, that they revolted against the British Empire, because in the British Empire, you were accorded certain privileges and duties, not based upon equal citizenship, but based upon your overlapping assigned group identities. And that's what we see beginning to happen in the 1970s through the EEOC, Title VI and Title VII, as well as even in Title IX, that in a very lawless way, we begin to manage and balance these different groups that only have their own interest in mind. You can see this, by the way, with some of the insular minorities who, when they talk about Donald Trump, will say something like, well, what have you done for my people? I think that's the dangerous part, is you only think about the good of your people.
Dr. Slack, we'll have you on again soon. Thank you so much. Check out the book. Very, very important. War on the American Republic. Thank you so much, Dr. Slack. Thank you.
Thank you.